By the spring of 1943, Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim stands over a map table in his field headquarters at Mikkeli. Outside, the temperature has dropped to -30. Somewhere to the east, a Soviet division of 15,000 men has just been completely surrounded in the forests near Suomussalmi. They have food for 2 days. The nearest relief column is frozen solid on a road it cannot navigate. Mannerheim does not celebrate. He has spent 40 years inside the Russian military system. He knows what he is looking at. Not a defeated enemy, a humiliated one. And he understands, better than anyone in Helsinki, the difference. This is the story of a country that fought one of the most remarkable defensive campaigns in modern military history, and then spent the next 4 years living with the consequences of believing its own legend. On November 30th, 1939, Soviet artillery opened fire across the Finnish border on 4 fronts simultaneously. 150,000 troops crossed into Finnish territory. The Leningrad military district had allocated 12 days for the operation. Soviet officers had reportedly packed dress uniforms for the victory parade in Helsinki. What followed defied every military calculation anyone had made. Soviet divisions sent through the central forests were surrounded and destroyed in engagements the Finns called moti, the Finnish word for a cubic meter of firewood, because that is what Soviet columns looked like from above when Finnish ski troops sealed both ends of a road and left everything inside to freeze. At Suomussalmi, Finnish forces under Colonel Siilasvuo destroyed an entire Soviet relief column on a road flanked by frozen lakes where tanks could not maneuver and artillery was useless in the trees. When Finnish forces swept the battlefield, they found 27,500 Soviet dead, 71 tanks, and 1,170 vehicles abandoned in the snow. By February 1940, Western newspapers were writing about Finnish soldiers as a new kind of warrior, a nation of 4 million holding an empire of 170 million to a standstill. When the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on March 13, 1940, Finland had not been conquered. It still existed. In the language of 1940, that felt like victory. It was not victory. The Finns lost 25,000 men killed in 105 days of fighting. The Soviets lost between 125,000 and 170,000. The disparity is real, and the Finnish performance was extraordinary by any measure. But Finland also lost 11% of its total territory. The entire Karelian Isthmus, gone. Finland's second largest city, Viborg, gone. Approximately 420,000 Finns, 12% of the entire population, evacuated from the ceded territories. They left their homes, their farms, their churches. They did not go back. A country that wins a war does not lose 12% of its territory. What Finland had achieved was not victory, it was survival. And in the context of what was happening next door, survival deserved serious respect. Poland had fought and been destroyed, its officer corps massacred at Katyn, its cities bombed into rubble, its existence as a nation erased. Finland had raised the cost of conquest high enough that Stalin chose a negotiated border revision over continued losses. The Soviet Union took the buffer strip it needed and stopped. That was the mission. That was what was achieved. But the myth that hardened around that survival, the myth of the invincible Finnish soldier, of Finland having defeated the Soviet Union, would shape every decision Finland made over the next 4 years. Within weeks of the Moscow Treaty being signed, Stalin had sacked his failed commanders, restructured Red Army doctrine, and begun systematic retraining based on exactly what the Finnish campaign had exposed. Timoshenko replaced Voroshilov. New tactical manuals were written. The army that had blundered into Finnish forests in 1939 was already transforming into something different. Mannerheim watched all of this from Helsinki and understood it in ways that Finnish politicians celebrating their victory simply did not. The survival Finland had purchased in the snow, how long would it last? The answer depended not on what Finland had done in the Winter War. It depended on what Finland would choose to do in the war that was already consuming the rest of Europe. And that choice was now less than 12 months away. Most people who know the Winter War story stop at the result and assume the explanation. Small country, big heart, impossible odds, miraculous defense. That framing is not wrong, it is just lazy. The Finnish military performance was not a miracle. It was the product of specific decisions, specific geography, specific doctrine, and a specific kind of soldier that the Soviet command structure was incapable of understanding until it was too late. Strip away the mythology, and what remains is actually more impressive than the myth, because it was deliberate. Finland, south of the Arctic Circle, is approximately 70% forest. The remaining 30% is lakes, rivers, and wetland. The road network in 1939 consisted largely of single-lane tracks through dense pine and birch. A Soviet mechanized column entering that terrain was not an armored fist. It was a steel ribbon stretched along a road it could not leave, flanks exposed to tree lines it could not see into, supply line extending backward through 50 kilometers of forest it did not control. Finnish military doctrine had spent 20 years designing around exactly this asymmetry. Finland could not match the Soviet Union in firepower, armor, or manpower. What Finland could do was force engagements in terrain that neutralized Soviet advantages and amplified Finnish ones. The Matti tactic was not improvised in the field. It had been wargamed and rehearsed throughout the 1930s. When Soviet columns entered the forests in December 1939, Finnish commanders were executing plans they had already practiced. The Soviets were improvising responses to situations their doctrine had told them would not arise. To understand what that looked like at ground level, consider one man. Simo Haiha was a farmer from southeastern Finland, 34 years old when the war began, unremarkable in every respect except one. He had spent his entire adult life hunting in those forests. He operated in temperatures that dropped to -40. He packed snow into his mouth before firing so his breath would not create vapor above his hide. He used iron sights rather than a scope because a scope catches light and gives away a position. In less than 100 days, he accumulated over 500 confirmed kills. Soviet commanders assigned dedicated counter-sniper teams specifically to find and eliminate him. In March 1940, an explosive bullet struck him in the jaw. He survived. He was still in a coma when the war ended. Haiha is the extreme end of a distribution, not its representative center. But the qualities he embodied, environmental familiarity, patience, physical endurance in extreme cold, were present across the entire Finnish citizen army in degrees that Soviet numerical superiority could not simply overwrite. The Finnish Air Force had 130 combat aircraft against Soviet 3,800. Finland lost 62 aircraft in the entire war. Soviet losses exceeded 900. The ratio was not explained by Finnish aircraft quality. It was explained by pilots fighting over terrain they had known since childhood against opponents who had not. And then February came, and everything changed. On February 1st, 1940, General Timoshenko launched a new offensive with methods that bore no resemblance to what had failed before. He had spent December and January conducting a systematic post-mortem of every Soviet failure. The new assault concentrated overwhelming artillery on narrow frontages and destroyed bunkers with direct-fire guns before infantry advanced. Soviet logistics were reorganized to sustain continuous fire rather than sporadic bursts. The Mannerheim line, which had held for 2 months, began cracking within days. On February 11th, Soviet forces achieved the first clean breakthrough on the isthmus. Finnish reserves were insufficient to seal it. By the end of February, the line was broken in multiple sectors. Mannerheim sent a formal assessment to the Finnish government. The army could sustain organized resistance for perhaps 2 to 3 more weeks before it collapsed entirely. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed not because Finland had been defeated. It was signed because Mannerheim's arithmetic said defeat was now a matter of weeks, and a negotiated border was preferable to a Soviet army in Helsinki. Mannerheim had built the entire Finnish defensive system around buying time, not winning a war. The Finnish army had performed every task its commander had asked of it. The tragedy is not that the legend that formed around that achievement was false. The tragedy is that Finland's political leadership believed it far more completely than Mannerheim ever did. And in the summer of 1941, that belief would lead Finland to make a decision that put everything it had survived directly back on the table. There is a word Finland invented for itself in 1941. Not ally, not partner, not combatant alongside the Third Reich. The word was co-belligerent, a country fighting the same enemy as Germany, at the same time as Germany, using German supplies, coordinating with German operational planning, but not, Finnish historians insisted for decades afterward, an ally. The distinction mattered enormously to Finland after the war. It matters somewhat less when you examine what actually happened between June 1941 and September 1944. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Finland was not surprised. Finnish and German military staffs had been in quiet contact since December 1940. German troops had been granted transit rights through Finnish territory. Finnish officers had attended German operational briefings. By the time Barbarossa began, Finland and Germany had already coordinated the outlines of a simultaneous Finnish offensive, not as a formal alliance, not with a signed treaty, but as a working military relationship that both parties understood perfectly well. The Soviet Union answered the question of Finnish participation for them. On June 25th, 3 days after Barbarossa began, Soviet aircraft bombed 17 Finnish cities. In Helsinki, ordinary people stood on street corners, watching smoke rise over their own rooftops. The Finnish government declared that Finland was again at war with the Soviet Union. The Soviet bombing gave Finnish politicians the domestic justification they needed. It also gave them a narrative they would cultivate for the next 80 years, that Finland had not chosen this war, that it had been attacked, that its participation was defensive in nature. That narrative contains enough truth to be credible and enough omission to be misleading. Finnish forces crossed the 1940 border in late June 1941, and by December, Finnish lines on the Karelian Isthmus ran to within 30 kilometers of Leningrad. Finland had not merely recovered what it lost in 1940, it had taken additional Soviet territory it had never held before, and positioned its forces on the outskirts of a city of 3 million people that German Army Group North was simultaneously attempting to starve into surrender. Finnish and German forces were not the same operation, but Finnish lines holding the northern siege perimeter made the full encirclement of Leningrad geometrically possible in ways that a Finnish withdrawal would have disrupted. Approximately 1 million civilians would die in that city over the following 900 days. Finland did not fire those shells, but Finnish lines made the geometry of the siege possible. That is not a comfortable fact. Finnish historiography has spent considerable energy making it less uncomfortable than it is. On December 6, 1941, Finnish Independence Day, the most sacred date in the Finnish national calendar, Britain formally declared war on Finland. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The country that had considered sending troops to help Finland against the Soviet Union less than 2 years ago chose Finland's Independence Day to announce they were now enemies. In Helsinki, the news arrived as Finns observed the holiday with the quiet solemnity of a people who had spent 2 years burying their dead. The Americans stopped short of a formal declaration, but severed all meaningful engagement. Finland had entered the war as the world's most sympathetically regarded small nation. By mid-1942, it was formally at war with Britain and estranged from the United States. Then, in the summer of 1942, Mannerheim did something no other commander in the German coalition did. He stopped. Finnish forces reached their objectives and halted. No further offensive operations were ordered. German requests for renewed action toward Leningrad and toward the Murmansk Railway were declined, deflected, or simply not acted upon. In June 1942, Hitler arrived in Finland ostensibly to congratulate Mannerheim on his 75th birthday. The meeting was recorded on audio by a Finnish radio technician who had left his equipment running by accident, the only known recording of Hitler in private, unscripted conversation. Hitler spoke at length about German strategic intentions. Mannerheim listened, offered nothing of substance, and continued doing exactly what he had already decided to do, because by the autumn of 1942, Stalingrad was 3 months away, and Mannerheim, who had watched the Soviet military absorb punishment and learn from it once before, was watching it happen again at a scale that dwarfed anything the Winter War had produced. Finland had bought its position through the sacrifice of its army. Keeping that position was going to require something different, the most delicate diplomatic operation any small nation had attempted since the war began. By the spring of 1943, Mannerheim was 75 years old, suffering from a stomach ulcer his doctors could not fully treat, and conducting a diplomatic operation he could not discuss openly with anyone outside a circle of 3 or 4 people. Stalingrad had fallen in February. The German Sixth Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. On the Soviet side, the architect of that encirclement was General Rokossovsky, a man who had spent 16 months in a Stalinist prison having his teeth knocked out during interrogations, been released when Stalin realized he needed competent generals more than confessions, and emerged to become perhaps the most gifted Soviet commander of the entire war. Mannerheim had read his operational reports through intelligence channels. He understood that the Soviet military he had bled in 1940 had produced, through catastrophic losses, commanders the 1939 Red Army had been incapable of generating. The question was no longer whether Germany would win. The question was whether Finland could extract itself before the Soviet Union decided that extraction needed to be achieved by force. The diplomatic channel ran through Paasikivi, the former diplomat who had negotiated with the Soviets before the Winter War and developed a theory of Finnish survival that was the direct opposite of the Winter War legend. In the autumn of 1943, quiet Finnish feelers moved through Stockholm and Lisbon. Stalin's answer demanded a return to the 1940 borders, expulsion of German forces, and reparations larger than Finland's entire annual national income. Finland rejected the terms in February 1944. Mannerheim understood what rejection meant. On June 9, 1944, it arrived. General Meretskov launched 300,000 Soviet troops against Finnish lines on the Karelian Isthmus, supported by 1 gun every meter and a half along the breakthrough sector. The bombardment delivered more shells onto Finnish positions than the entire Finnish army had fired in the whole of the Winter War. Private Eino Luukkonen of the 10th Division wrote in a letter that was censored and never sent, "We had trained for war, and this was not war. This was weather. This was something the earth was doing to itself, and we were simply inside it." The first Finnish defensive line collapsed within 24 hours. By June 20th, Soviet forces had retaken Vyborg. Mannerheim traveled personally to the Isthmus front and issued a single order: the line would hold. Every available reserve was committed to the Tali-Ihantala sector, where geography compressed the Soviet offensive into a frontage Finnish defenders could actually cover. The battle lasted from June 25th to July 9th, the largest battle ever fought on Nordic soil. On July 2nd alone, the Soviet 97th Corps lost 41 tanks in the Ihantala Valley in under 3 hours. Meretskov made the same calculation Stalin had made in March 1940. The offensive halted. Simultaneously, Finnish President Ritti had signed a personal letter to Hitler pledging Finland would not conclude a separate peace, the price of an emergency German arms shipment. Ritti signed it as a personal commitment rather than a state treaty, specifically so a future government could argue it was not legally binding. It was a legal fiction constructed with deliberate precision to be used exactly once. The weapons arrived. The line held. In August, Ritti resigned. Mannerheim was appointed president. The new government announced the letter was a personal commitment of the previous president and not binding on the current one. The legal fiction worked. The Germans understood exactly what had happened and could do nothing about it. The Moscow Armistice was signed on September 19, 1944. Finland returned to the 1940 borders. Vyborg was Soviet again. Reparations of $300 million were imposed. Finland was required to expel German forces from its own territory, producing the Lapland War, in which Finnish and German forces that had fought side by side for 3 years now fought each other, the retreating Germans burning every structure in Lapland as they withdrew. Rovaniemi was burned to the ground. 100,000 Finns evacuated and returned to ash. The terms were harsh, they were survivable, and the question of what survivable actually cost, in territory, in sovereignty, in the permanent shadow of a neighbor that had twice tried to absorb you, was still waiting for an answer that would take decades to fully emerge.
Narrative story. Finland entered the post-war world as something that had no precise category in the political vocabulary of 1945. Not a victor, not an occupied country, not a Soviet satellite, though it shared a border of over 1,000 kilometers with the Soviet Union and had fought against it twice in 5 years. Not fully Western, though its political system was democratic and its press was free. It occupied a position no other country in Europe occupied, entirely alone. What Finland had purchased through the Winter War, the Continuation War, Tali-Ihantala, the Ritti letter, and the Moscow Armistice was not freedom in the full sense that Norway or Denmark understood freedom after 1945. It was a constrained, carefully managed version of independence that required permanent awareness that the neighbor to the east was watching every decision Helsinki made and drawing conclusions from each one. The word that attached itself to this arrangement was Finlandization, coined not by Finns but by a West German politician in the 1960s as a warning about accommodation of Soviet power. The Finns hated the word. They still hate it, because from inside Finland, what looked like accommodation looked like survival. Finnish presidents maintained careful personal relationships with Soviet leaders. Finnish newspapers practiced self-censorship around Soviet topics that required no formal instruction because the consequences were understood by everyone. Finland did not join NATO, did not join the European Economic Community until 1995, maintained a studied neutrality that often required treating Soviet actions with diplomatic equanimity it did not extend to comparable Western ones. This was the price. Not paid once in a peace treaty, paid continuously, every day, for 46 years, until the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. Estonia regained its independence that same year, and within 13 years had joined both NATO and the European Union, covering in 13 years the distance Finland had spent 46 years carefully not traveling. That contrast is not a judgment, it is a measurement of what the different choices of 1940 had cost and what they had preserved. The reparations Finland paid produced an outcome nobody anticipated. The Soviet Union demanded ships, machinery, and precision equipment. Finland did not have the industrial capacity to produce them at scale, so Finland built it.
The shipyards expanded, the engineering firms retooled, the manufacturing base developed to satisfy Soviet reparation schedules became the foundation of the Finnish economic miracle of the post-war decades. By the 1970s, Finland's GDP per capita was among the highest in Europe. Nokia, which would briefly become the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer, grew from an industrial base whose development had been partly forced by Soviet reparation demands. Stalin had demanded manufactured goods as punishment. Finland had built a manufacturing economy as a consequence. History does not often produce ironies this precise. The 420,000 Karelian Finns evacuated from the ceded territories never went home. Vyborg became a Soviet and then Russian city where Finnish street names are barely visible beneath Cyrillic signage, and the wooden houses of the old Finnish quarter have mostly rotted in the decades since the last Finnish family left. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and Finnish politicians cautiously raised the possibility of discussing Karelia, Russia's answer was the same it had been giving since 1944: no. Mannerheim himself died in Lausanne on January 27, 1951, 83 years old, having spent his final years writing memoirs that shaped how posterity would understand decisions that the historical record insisted on making more complicated than any memoir could contain. He is buried in Helsinki under a simple stone that gives his name, his dates, and nothing else. Every Finnish Independence Day, people leave flowers. The flowers are always there regardless of weather, regardless of what Finland's relationship with Russia happens to be in any given year. That continuity is itself an answer to the question this story has been asking since its first chapter. Not whether Finland won or lost, not whether its choices were moral or pragmatic or both or neither, but whether the thing that was preserved was worth the price paid to preserve it. The Finns who leave those flowers have answered that question for themselves. Finland is still there. After everything, the Winter War, the Continuation War, the Armistice, the reparations, the decades of constrained sovereignty, the permanent shadow of the East, Finland is still there. And for a small country on the edge of a continent that spent the 20th century destroying itself, still there is not nothing. Still there, in the end, is everything.